Everyone. My name is Ron Roby. I've been a perennial Liberty Forum attendee since 2010, and I'm here today to introduce your moderator for the cryptocurrency panel. Please welcome Stephen Zeiler.
Well, give it up for these awesome panelists, first of all. They all spoke earlier. I'm sure many of you heard them, and we're very delighted to hear their brains and what they're thinking. Starting here, I have my esteemed panelists, Preston Byrne, Paige Peterson, Jeremy Kauffman, and the one and only Joel. These guys are really into crypto, so I'm so happy to have everyone here and honored to be here at Liberty Forum. I'm Stephen Zeiler. I am the creator of AnyPay, New Hampshire's most popular crypto point-of-sale system. Yes, AnyPay is awesome. You've probably seen it. Many of you have used it around here at Liberty Forum to buy things, buy tickets for Portfest, buy merchandise, Murphy's Tap Room, and about 50 other businesses in Portsmouth use this system to accept Dash and Bitcoin Cash. And I'm very focused on Bitcoin Cash. All right, okay, well it's Bitcoin. All right, we won't say Bitcoin Cash anymore. It's Bitcoin and Dash. All right, that's what they're accepting. So I'm very focused on expanding the economy of cryptocurrency outside of the Portfest vendor group of people. They've been using cryptocurrency for a long time. And I moved here 2 years ago. Since then, the number of retail vendors in New Hampshire that accept crypto has gone up like 5x, especially because of AnyPay. So I'm really excited. But it's only it's in the very beginning stages of being a great product. And it's a lot of work we have to do to make retail crypto payments more freedom-oriented, more private, more independent from the Fed system and from the state. And that's what we're going to discuss here today and really get a lot of great insights. First of all, let's start with Jeremy. You're making a very interesting product that has nothing to do with retail payments. But I'm really fascinated, so I wanted to start. We actually received library credits for some art earlier as a payment. That's not how library credits are supposed to work, is it?
Well, I mean, you're welcome to trade them for whatever you want to trade them for. Yeah. But our thought process around blockchain was, I thought of blockchain as a database technology first, not as a new kind of money first. Like, it's necessary that they're traded, but as a computer scientist, my thought process was, this is a new kind of database, and what is that useful for? And that was what drove us to create Library, was to use a database for a digital content repository. But those tokens need to be traded, and those tokens need to have a value for the system to work. So it makes sense that people would use them to pay for things, but it's just not something we've focused on causing to happen the way that some other cryptocurrencies have.
Okay, well, how are the tokens used? Are they used as money within the library system?
Yeah, they're used within the system, so you use them both to pay for content and to make publishes. So basically, every entry into the library blockchain that says, hey, this piece of content is available, that's using the library cryptocurrency to make that happen.
Okay, cool. So it became a currency, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it really, in a more true sense than some of the other ones. I mean, Library didn't do an ICO. We just kind of launched the blockchain and put it out in the wild. And so, like, the price of a library credit was entirely determined by the market. There was no structure that we created to try to derive that price.
Well, that's pretty cool that it became something that has value. And that you guys basically created a new form of transferable value. It's pretty awesome, and you didn't even mean to do it. On the other hand, we have Paige here, who is a huge fan of Zcash. And I love Zcash too. I'm really into privacy. Paige, did Zcash set out to create a type of money? Is that right?
Yeah, we wanted to create essentially the actual cryptocurrency, which is money that you can transfer without the entire world seeing. So if I pay you $10 in fiat cash, like physical cash, that's a pretty standard way of, or something that you should expect when you're dealing with money, or even if you're like paying with a traditional credit card, you don't anticipate the entire world is going to see that transaction, and that it's between you and the merchants, or maybe some third party as well. But that financial data is kept to a minimum, and that's kind of the goal of Zcash, is to be this internet money, which, you know, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies set out with the best intention to create, but they kind of left out this really key point, which is basic personal financial privacy.
Okay, well, how many people here try to avoid corporations knowing where they spend their money? Like actively or trying to do that? Okay, well that's awesome. And Preston, is it important for you to have corporations not know where you spend your money? Do you think that's an important element of money?
I love corporations. I think they're fantastic. I mean, I don't know. Is it important? It depends on the transaction. I think that Bitcoin does have some. So if you read the Bitcoin white paper, at the very beginning it says we want to replace. We want to have a system of electronic cash which operates on cryptographic proof instead of trust. Why did Satoshi say he wanted that? If we continue reading the opening paragraph, it was so you don't have to hassle people for more information than you otherwise need. And so generally speaking, what a blockchain of any description allows you to do is it allows you to swap out PII that you would normally need to verify a transfer and chase someone down. And what you do instead is you say, we don't need that, we just need the key. And once the key happens, we can unit test the system. So we can say, if this has happened, then we know that the payment is cleared. And so there are a whole bunch of different ways you can approach that. Bitcoin does it in a very open and public way. Monero or Zcash do it in a more private way. And then you have permission systems which are being developed as well by the big enterprises. And they're starting to automate things on top of things that are automating supply chain finance. So if you see a transaction, order a banana from Guatemala or something, and you want to verify the provenance of the banana as it moves through the supply chain, you can see that various keys have been submitted at various points in the transaction at a time, and you can say, you know what, I know that this hasn't been falsified, so when the banana finally arrives at my table, I know that it's an ethical banana. If ethical bananas are your thing, I don't know. So I think for me, when I look at cryptocurrencies, obviously being a lawyer, you look at it very differently than an entrepreneur, because you see all kinds of risks. But the one benefit that I think is indisputable is that you can replace SQL logins and you can replace personally identifiable information with a public key. And so that, it's really simple, it's really basic, but it's extremely effective in increasing the threshold of privacy and decreasing the amount of disclosure required to prove that something's happened.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I hate logging in with email and password, and I really don't like providing information. Not only because I don't want to give information, but corporations are always hacked all the time, and your credit card data is stolen and everything. So it's great that cryptographic technology can replace those things. Paige said that privacy is very important with cash, and Dash stands for digital cash. Is Dash digital cash, or is it something else?
I'd say absolutely, yeah. Dash's first claim to fame was as dark coin back in 2014, the first great privacy coin, and still has diversified into trying to be actually usable for everyday transactions, but still maintains that ironclad privacy that has always made it popular since the beginning. And that's an interesting thing about the space now is, first it was Bitcoin. It just kind of did everything. And then all these other projects have tried variations on Bitcoin, very different approaches to different problems sometimes different approaches to the exact same problem. And so For example, when we have encrypted privacy methods, Dash uses an obfuscation in hiding in plain sight through a mixing service. And well, 4 years later, still has yet to be broken, and there's like at least a 15 grand bounty if you can trace the Dash private set transaction. So when you guys have figured it out, easy money. So yes, I absolutely think that privacy is key to anything trying to be digital cash. And the other side of that equation is usability, and that's going to be the next frontier, in my view, is how can you maintain perfect privacy, or as close to it as you can get, while still making it usable on, for example, mobile devices.
All right, well, has everyone used Dash before to buy something? Who has not used Dash to buy something? Okay, so like more than half.
50, huh?
More than half. Okay, of all the people who have used Dash recently, how many used the privacy feature, the mixer? All right. What percentage of time would you say that you use the privacy mixer when you use Dash? Okay, so he's used it one time. So I want everyone to know about Dash, that this privacy feature that they talk about is never used. It's plain and simple. It really is not used, and the reason is it doesn't work on mobile devices. That's just how it is, and it's nice you can mix your coins one time, but most people who are using Dash are not using these features, and transactions can be traced from person to person, and the IPs are logged, and so, I don't know. Paige, what do you think? Is Dash cash or is it something else? What is it?
I would say that it's maybe it's good to add a level of obfuscation for your financial transactions, but I would be nervous, kind of like looking back historically, if someone were able to, get this bounty or whatever, that it is kind of like these mixing things are permanently stored on the blockchain. So if you do crack it, you kind of like figure out all of the, like, I don't see it as a permanent solution. It's not secure enough for me in my like need for wanting things to be as private as possible. That said, it's good that there's different attempts at privacy technologies going on at the same time. I just prefer the stronger, more kind of cryptographic attempts. And kind of similarly, I don't know if y'all have heard of Monero Link. This is a it doesn't still exist within the Monero protocol today, so they fixed this issue, but it was essentially a problem where prior to their enforcement of 4+ mix-ins to their mixing technology, there was a research team that did an empirical analysis of the Monero blockchain and was able to basically de-anonymize 80 or 90% of the transactions prior to 2016 or 2015, I forget. So like you have to really consider that all of these things are happening within a blockchain, which is a permanent record. So if you, if anything ever gets broken, then it's permanently broken all the way back into history, into the beginning of the blockchain. So, I mean, even with Zcash, if the zero knowledge proofs are broken, then that's going to be an issue. Well, that's going to be an issue in some ways. You kind of, at least with Zcash, you have to separate, because Zcash uses actual encryption. It's not just like taking a bunch of different things and mixing them together and you don't know which one is whose. You're actually encrypting the data. So if you're using tried and tested encryption, which is what Zcash uses, then maybe one day we'll face quantum computing issues, but if we face quantum computing issues, there's going to be a lot of other problems that we're going to see. So I don't know. All of this is really scary because yes, this is all on a public, like a permanent ledger. I think that's what the issue really comes down to, is if you break a privacy technology on a blockchain, then you're breaking it all the way back into history. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like none of these technologies are cash. They're not as good as handing someone physical paper.
I agree. I mean, yeah, if you're trying to be private, then yes, there's not going to be anything that is as good as two people being in a closed room without anyone else seeing or having any other record of that transaction happening.
Steven, if I hand you a $10 bill, there's some records left on that bill as well.
Fingerprints? Yeah.
DNA, yeah.
Fair enough, yeah, DNA, okay, so none of these are good. How are we going to do this? Maybe
But it costs a lot more to analyze DNA, so there are companies, several companies that are built around the idea of, well, specifically they started with the Bitcoin blockchain, CoinSpect, a number of others, but their primary customers are law enforcement, so they get paid to de-anonymize and create public profiles around addresses and transactions and things. So it's a pretty interesting and scary thing, and people should definitely be aware of it no matter what cryptocurrency they're using. And additionally, remember that all of this is happening on the internet, which uses IP addresses. So you know, if you're creating transactions that are submitted to the internet and you're creating them from your home IP address, and that's also relatively not that difficult to keep track of. So it's all a matter of risk assessment. How much risk are you willing to take and all that?
All right, so we've come a long way with privacy with cryptocurrency. We don't have to give our ID to transfer money internationally, for instance. You know, that's awesome. The cryptocurrency movement also is trying to create better money in a lot of ways, and one of the big challenges is how to eliminate the monopoly on money printing. So most people, I'm sure, are aware of the Federal Reserve. How many trillions, or actually no one knows how many trillions they create, but they can create money all the time, as much as they want, and then it devalues the savings of everyone. It's a very big problem, and here in New Hampshire we're looking for independence from, in many ways, economic independence, financial, political, from the Fed system. What do any of you see in the cryptocurrency space? People trying to create like sound money or really good quality money, things that can be used as a unit of account or for planning or for storing wealth. Yeah, Preston?
Well, just to preface this, I tend to find that people think the best money is the one that they happen to hold a lot of. In the cryptocurrency space, there's a lot of that. But one thing I would actually disagree with you on is that the Fed has a monopoly on the creation of money, because it doesn't, and it never has. Banks and other institutions that provide money substitutes for hundreds of years, since the 1750s, 1720s, have issued instruments which have stepped into the place of money and formed money substitutes. So in the credit crisis of 1777, it was bills of exchange that were issued by basically corrupt Scottish banks that caused the credit crisis, because they were drawing the same instrument multiple times on the same deposit. So that was very early fractional reserve. Similarly, in 2008, I'm going to be the most popular person at this conference, I think, because I was a mortgage-backed securities lawyer. And so mortgage-backed securities that were rated AAA were effectively as good as money. In Europe, they had a failure rate of 0.2%, which is pretty robust considering that Lehman Brothers International Europe went down. And then in the US, obviously, for a very brief period of time, in Q3-4, the failure rate was 25%, but then it very swiftly recovered once these deals were restructured. So from what I'm seeing on the enterprise blockchain side of things is that people are coming up with new, so if you're thinking about how to use a blockchain in an enterprise setting, you set up a new broker-dealer, you start issuing securities, your securities are using blockchain like Bitcoin style, using whatever type of transaction style, and you're trying to shave basis points off of your cost of issuing those instruments. So if you can increase or democratize and decrease the costs of issuing securities, what you can then do is you can have a smaller bank automatically do things that currently only big banks like Citi or JP Morgan can do. So if you can then go and get Marin Bank or Silicon Valley Bank going and issuing these instruments very cheaply, suddenly you have a lot more power in the hands of local financial institutions, rather than currently they all have to go through the big commercial banks in order to do this. So that might be a kind of lame, like, why, he just loves corporations. But I think if we look at the way banking used to be, it used to be very broadly, banking used to be distributed back in the 30s, and then it became very concentrated over the course of the 20th century. This technology has the ability to, again, distribute banking again. And I think that will be, in sum, a good thing, because you could have a New Hampshire bank that would be able to issue its own securities and do complex financial transactions, which currently requires a lot of manpower before.
Okay, cool. So that's really awesome. You're saying that banks create money instruments, and they can do that whenever they want it at their own whim.
I mean, banks create money. Banks create money, so that's how fractional reserve banking works. At the moment, banking is, and so like 10 years ago, banking was super hot, they were getting a lot of fees, there's a lot of manpower, and what you're starting to see in the industry is there are fewer and fewer bankers required as more and more of this stuff gets automated. So that, at the moment, is having the effect of sort of trimming the payroll of the big banks, who, while unpopular, they perform an important systemic function in our society. But the question is, where do we want that power to sit? Would we rather have that power sit with a huge bank in New York, or are we okay with a bank and with shareholders as a corporation? But maybe we have a bank here, in Manchester, which, because of the transparency and automation that blockchains allow, suddenly allows that bank to do tasks more quickly and effectively that before were really only accessible to Citi or Goldman.
Well, so there's all these banks creating money. Is there room for a underlying currency that is transacted between these banks to keep them honest? I don't quite know. Like, it used to be that banks would hold gold, and then they would issue their own currencies or securities, and often they would be you could redeem them for gold. Do you see that a digital currency form playing a role, or is that not necessary?
It's not necessary, but it's not unnecessary either. I mean, so this Bitcoin is meme money, right? It's stuff that people have just conjured out of thin air. I don't think the story is over. I don't think the story is done being told. I don't think what we see as a cryptocurrency is its final form by any stretch of the imagination. So I was mentioning earlier this morning the concept of a trust, which is a type of relationship that involves fiduciary obligations. At one point that didn't exist 500 years ago. Now it does, and it's used all the time, and it facilitates very efficient financial transactions. Similarly with cryptocurrency, everyone's like, oh my God, this new thing, we don't know how to deal with it, what do we do? I don't think by any stretch of the imagination it's anywhere near as embedded as it could be in society, or useful as it could be, or as diverse as it could be. So we could just find that these new organizations that have sprung up, the people who created themselves, the law will wrap itself around them, and then gradually find a place for them all. I've done enough talking about this.
All right, let's see. Does anyone have any questions so far? Any curiosities? Where'd the mic go?
Right here.
Oh. Want to come up and ask?
Thanks. So this question is kind of inspired by Ricardo Spagni, who's on the Monero team, and I kind of, his thought is that one privacy coin will dominate, because if you're trying to have secure private transactions, you want to be in the largest pool of transactions. So my question to you is, do you think that we will see one privacy coin, or just a normal coin, kind of go on to dominate, or is the competition good, healthy, and there will be many different ones?
Right. Mind if I take this? I believe in a free market, right? And right now, cryptocurrency is one of the freest markets there is. Just pretty much Wild West days. And obviously, you do see some approaches dominate more than others, but absolute monopolies, in my view, are mainly through government coercion, right? So there might be different approaches that work better in the long run, different technologies that kind of find their way of being the forefront of this sort of approach. But there might be, for example, what happens if there's a privacy coin that has the absolute best privacy, airtight, just no one's ever been able to break it, and everyone else, it's like the gold standard for privacy. But then what happens if you get someone who says, I'm going to fork that coin and have the exact same coin, but I'm going to add some like extra governance features in the back or something like that and make it more of a DAO, like a decentralized autonomous organization. And I'm going to just take their, if you literally fork the code, take that exact airtight privacy, but make it a better coin to be used in other ways. And that way, all of a sudden that monopolistic sort of system is just crashes overnight, and then now you have competition. So I don't know if one privacy avenue will dominate over time, right? For example, one of the concerns with encrypted privacy methods is quantum computing, of course, and as Dash's founder, Evan Duffield, has said before, he calls Dash's solution, he calls it off-chain privacy solutions, and he favors them for a more quantum resistant approach, which of course you'd have to ask someone much more technical than me to expound on that. But I do believe that there would be multiple avenues, but even if one avenue ends up dominating, I don't see why one coin, why there would have to be like a one-trick pony, pardon the pun, that just only does this one thing really well. Why couldn't you make sure it's scalable and usable and do some extra things or transmit things other than just financial transactions, like data, for example? So I don't really personally believe that there will have just the one coin to rule them all in this regard.
Oh yeah, and Jeremy, in this vein, the library token is not widely used, but it has value. Do you see like just a bunch of tokens being interchangeable and being able to spend in different places?
I mean, well, that already exists, where token and the technologies for exchanging between coins are only getting better. So if you're asking for the general case, blockchain generally, I think the answer is there'll be lots and lots of blockchains, right? Because a blockchain is a database, and so thinking that all of the world's applications are going to use the same database is like kind of crazy. Now the question specifically about how one application, privacy, which is one application of the database, there's a first order reason that you would expect one to win out, which is network effects, right? I want to use the coin that other people are using. But at least as of now, blockchain scaling is a completely unsolved problem. And blockchains have anti-scaling properties. The more successful my blockchain is, the more expensive it is to use. So that's a very strong reason right there that until we solve that problem, you're not going to see everything happening on one blockchain, even inside of one application domain.
I would also just like to add that I don't really see the argument of fluffy pony there, but I would also say that maybe, if you're hiding within a group of 1 million people versus hiding within a group of like 2 million people, is there really a distinction there? I don't know. So I think there's potentially room for a couple in the future. And with like competing actual privacy technologies. So for example, ring signatures and zero-knowledge proofs are completely different technologies. What if one of them is actually broken? Then, at least there's something there for people to use as a backup in the long run. I don't know. So I see there's room, maybe not for tens of them, but for a few competing ones to maintain a top place.
There's a great FT article by a journalist in London called Isabella Kaminska. It's called Attack of the Killer Rentiers. And it's about basically how Bitcoin is the sort of last vestige of capitalism in the digital age, and that it's creating artificial scarcity, whereas before it was art was scarce, or resources were scarce. Well, now nothing is scarce in the digital age, so they had to make something scarce, so they make money scarce. The important thing to remember in that context is that substitution costs for the cryptocurrency are zero. So as long as you have one, and as long as you have a sufficient pool of liquidity, to make it relevant, you can basically take denominated in fiat, you can take $1 million of Bitcoin and turn it into $1 million of anything else instantaneously. So that tends to militate against the idea that there would be one, and more of them is that there will be many.
Okay, so if I can understand, because there could be liquidity between all different coins, there might as well just be unlimited coins, or whatever liquidity can support.
Well, as long as so the thing is performing a function, right? So if I need to get from A to B, I can get there in a Toyota, I can get there in a Ford, I can get there in a Mercury, I can get there in a Mercedes. So it doesn't matter which one I pick. Fundamentally, the tool is available and it can get me to my destination. So with cryptocurrency, the liquidity in a given market is what allows you to do the value storage and transfer function. So if you have 10 different ones that are sort of populated with different constituencies, like Super, then you can go and use one of the 10 and you can still get money from A to B. And in fact, the market is designed to do that because, as everybody said, blockchains don't scale. So the more you have, the less of a burden each individual one has to bear in order to perform that function, and the more efficiently all of them function, fees are lower, the size of the blockchain is lower. So it just depends. So it's a really good thing that you have all this diversity because it just keeps costs down and keeps the labor distributed.
One second. Is there, so we're under a government-created fiat currency system, the dollar. Most people say the dollar is backed by taxes, essentially. What, if any, moral imperative is there to not accept that form of currency for your energy?
Long term, I think there's a very strong moral imperative, right? I do think that a free people should use a free money. I do believe that technologies and approaches and systems that make people freer and better off should always be given priority and hopefully dominate the world someday. Short term, it's like a sliding scale. The more you can edge your life over that way, the better. The more you can edge the world over, the better. For example, I'm a big advocate of if some business is taking fiat currency and that's all they take, and that's all they will take, that's all they can take, sign them up for something that allows them to take cryptocurrency and then transfer it to fiat. Of course, I'd much rather have them just keep fiat, which is keep the cryptocurrency, which is one of the reasons why New Hampshire is such a great place. There's so many, thanks to Stephen, in a very large part, there's a lot of places that accept and keep their cryptocurrency, which is the ultimate goal. I like the sliding scale because then once you can spend it everywhere, even if no one's keeping it, and then one person keeps it, it gets to be spent everywhere. And I mean, obviously not everyone is on equal abilities to be radical. I mean, I haven't had a bank account for a couple of years now. I live entirely off of cryptocurrency, did not on Bitcoin before Dash, but it's not that easy for me yet. I do have to touch the dirty fiat once in a while. And I'm not also advocating that everyone in this room be like, just go close down your bank account, only take crypto, because it's not necessarily realistic for everyone. But the closer you can get to that, I think morally is probably better.
Does anyone disagree or think that there is no moral imperative?
I mean, I'll play the heel a little bit, I guess. I'm not going to say that it's not. I'm not going to go and say it's not a good thing to try to avoid doing that. But I would say that at a minimum, there's an opportunity cost, and so you have to weigh if the additional costs that I am bearing by trying to escape the system. That is a cost to me. Could I instead have done something else that was of greater net benefit to the cause of liberty? So I do agree you have some kind of obligation to help the cause. But if you are just dropping out, I'm not. Maybe better to stay in and help more rather than just dropping out, I guess.
All right. Preston, is taxation theft? Quick answer, yes or no?
See, this is not fair because he knows that I have to go back and work for Big Law, which means no matter how I answer it. I think taxation, so there is a phrase, taxation is theft. And I think that from a legal perspective, it's a good way of illustrating how taxation has evolved over the last 100 years. I think it's been a grundnorm, as Hans Kelsen would have called it, in every society on earth since the Code of Hammurabi was written, that taxation happens. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that it's going to go away anytime soon. I think it's more realistic to say it was 3% of GDP in 1910, and it's 29% of GDP today, of which, and then that's not counting the debt finance, which is also being stacked on top of it in the long term. So I think rather than taxation as theft is a good way of saying, somehow they built roads in 1910 while taking far less money, and somehow society managed to, the human existence managed to get by just fine for 10,000 years without taking 1/3 of all that was produced and putting it into government coffers.
All right, so it's more theft than it used to be.
I would say that taxation is not theft if there's a one-to-one relationship to the government service that's being provided for that taxation. Of course, they make it involuntary, it's kind of thefty, but if you're actually getting a service for it, it's not theft, it's kind of like user fee, you're paying for a service.
Great. What was your question?
All right, well, it's been a little while, so. Is there such a thing as a non-public blockchain-based cryptocurrency where you don't have to have this big database out there that everybody can see, and yet it's still secure and basically not counterfeitable?
I want to start answering that. So is there such a thing as a non-public blockchain database? Well, or cryptocurrency. There are techniques of using cryptocurrency that move funds outside of a public blockchain, which then ultimately settle later on the public blockchain.
It still makes it the public blockchain eventually.
Yes, but it's imagine that you do a lot of transactions, like you have a bar tab and you're paying your bartender for a bunch of different drinks. And then like at the end of the month, you're paying.
Indefinitely though, it would never have to go on a public blockchain.
Right.
Is there such a thing? Yeah.
Yeah, there's one in London which is being operated among, basically, I think it's the Bank of New York, UBS, I want to say Credit Suisse, I could be wrong. So there are 4 banks that basically said, we're going to have a cryptocurrency on an Ethereum-based blockchain. I'm not going to name it, but basically they said we have the system among us which allows us to get around CLS, which is a big clearing service provider in London. So yeah, you can, but basically there what you're doing is you say we have a certain amount of funds, it's in custody, pursuant to a given contract.
So they're trading the public blockchain there for a private one where you actually have to go to a centralized authority to verify that some transactions occurred.
So what's public and private on a blockchain is relative. So if you're saying, if you're talking to 4 other banks, the information that you're talking to these other banks about might be private vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but there might be a public and private component between you. So if you're doing a complex financial transaction in bonds, there will be maybe 4 or 5 different transaction counterparties. There will be data among those counterparties that, on request, you can get at any time from some intermediary like a bond registrar.
I guess what I'm looking for is something comparable to cash. If there's some kind of cryptocurrency that would be just private between the buyer and the seller and never really has to be verified after the transaction.
Yes, and you don't know about them because they're private.
You mean as a system, as a
They've been built, they're currently private deployments among the banks.
So with these, if I understand them correctly, not everyone, first of all, can be a peer in the network. So you need to be authenticated, and then also not everyone can submit transactions without authentication.
Yeah, I mean, can you have a secure private blockchain? I mean, absolutely, I can have a secure server sitting in my house, right? Like you can secure any machine, so of course you can have a secure private blockchain. But a public blockchain and a private blockchain are such fundamentally different technologies that it bothers me. We just use an adjective to differentiate between the two of them. Right? Like the insight of Bitcoin was the development of a public blockchain. That is the insight. Okay, a private blockchain is a co-option of that idea because the idea of a public blockchain doesn't fit the use case of a lot of companies. But they like the idea of blockchain to get their pet projects done. So they say we're going to use a private blockchain. Okay, nothing these companies are doing with a private blockchain couldn't have been done a decade ago. Couldn't have been done 2 decades ago. There's very little. I'm not going to say there's nothing. There's very little.
public blockchain is just to verify publicly that a transaction has occurred and nobody can counterfeit that again.
the difference, I'm a private blockchain guy, in case you can't tell, but the difference is really, in my view at least, it's consensus and how you determine it. So you can have virtually identical technology, but then what you do is you say, we've got a bunch of transactions, we put them into a block. How do we determine how the block gets onto the end of the chain? So the public blockchain, you set up a game of sorts and people compete to find the answer. But equally, you could do something where you say, well, we've got these 10 signatures, and if we get 7 out of 10, then that'll be consensus as far as we're concerned, and we'll approve this block at the end of the chain. So it's really, what's interesting about it from the private chains. Public chains are more interesting, they're more captivating, they're more revolutionary, they're more radical. But private chains, at the same time, they allow you to experiment with how decisions are made and how consensus is arrived at. So it's different sides of the same coin.
So it sounds like the answer is no.
Well, one thing we got to realize is there's plenty of private systems of accounting internally. The point of a distributed public ledger is radical transparency. And that's the bonus, that's really why we're all here. It's not because of increased privacy, but it's because of increased transparency, right? For centuries, for millennia, there have been governments that have been doing all kinds of shady number cooking in private, all kinds of stealing money, putting zeros on the end. That's what we're trying to fight, and that's why something like Bitcoin coming on the scene changed the whole game, because it made it radically transparent and publicly verifiable by anyone. Now, that's one of those bonuses that's one of those things that when you talk about, oh, we were doing the privacy, which has more privacy, the reason it's always going to be such an arms race is because you're trying to make something that's radically transparent still optionally private for you. And that's a big challenge, because you're trying to keep the benefits of radical transparency while still not exposing yourself to undue risk and information.
Okay, I think the answer is no.
Right. Well, speaking on off-chain transactions, I'm not sure if any of you have any insights into what's called as second layer technologies or Lightning Network technologies, and have any thoughts on that, if you think that that's viable for people to use, or are you excited about it?
Yeah, so I think the generic terminology for things like Lightning Network is payment channels. I think that without commenting on that technology specifically in terms of whether it will work or not, of which there are questions, and you don't know for sure until it works in the real world, I guess, succinctly is my answer. It's absolutely necessary. Like, again, in fact, it's something that I like to push back on at times with people who are really enthusiastic about blockchain, and sometimes people get mad at me, but blockchains are, I said this earlier, they are a fundamentally inefficient technology. That everything you're doing on a blockchain has to be done, is generally being done millions of times in replicate, when it was previously done on a single computer. That uses more real-world resources. There's a real-world cost to that. And the more popular a blockchain is, the more real-world resources are being devoted to mining it, and therefore that's the more increased cost in performing the transactions. So if we really want to see this technology work and be used at the scales that we want it to be, there has to be a way of not doing everything on-chain, or there has to be a development of far more efficient technologies for doing everything on-chain. But right now, and this is, in my opinion, is an unsolved problem. I'm not claiming that people don't claim that they have solutions, but we have not seen any of these solutions provably work at scale in the real world.
Yeah, so definitely, this is one of those interesting, the second layer concept is, of course, always necessary for scaling if you're trying to have something that works for everything, right? So, for example, something that's super cryptographically secure, super sound, that's one use case. But if you're trying to do micropayments, for example, what happens if I wanted to tip everyone in the room, right? Just like, hey, you everyone, and you get a coin, everyone gets a coin, right? You want to do something like that, and you just clog up the blockchain with all these you're gonna need we gave out 79 new Dash wallets over the weekend. I think that's a lot for just one conference. What if people all over the world are doing that? And just, you get some. So to scale, you absolutely would want that kind of option. I don't think it's a replacement for transactions. There's a bunch of cool stuff you could do with that technology. For example, you could do a streaming kind of thing. For example, what happens if with a parking meter, for example, you're paying that bit by bit by bit. For every minute, it charges a new little fraction of a cent or whatever, and then eventually you settle on the public blockchain for that. Also, one use for an off-chain payment channel would be a merchant transaction, because blockchain transactions, cryptocurrency transactions, are irreversible right now. So what if you could buy something from a merchant, you open up a temporary channel, and you pay the merchant, and then when you get the goods and they're intact, you settle and they get all the money. What if they're not intact and you don't get, what if you never get it and you don't send them the money, right? Or what happens if they're damaged and you have an arbiter that comes in and figures out you get a 30% discount or whatever because they're damaged, and then that settles on chain.
Okay.
But yes, lots of uses.
We have a few more questions.
Can I just throw in that payment channels aren't the only scaling solution, so we shouldn't be keeping our...
Correct. I didn't mean to imply that either.
There's actually a lot of cool research with zero knowledge proofs that are starting to happen, where you could potentially verify basically a whole section of a blockchain and kind of just cut it off and then start going forward from there. So you're not required to store the entire blockchain. This is a lot of ongoing research, but it's not. Payment channels are just one kind of second layer solution for scaling, and they're still very unusable just because of double transactions for opening and closing payment channels and all this other stuff. Most people are only doing one transaction with a merchant. They're not keeping a channel open, all these other considerations to look into. So it is promising and it would be great, but I think we should definitely not constrict ourselves to payment channels.
We're just waiting for someone else to solve this problem so we can copy it. That's what we're doing.
You solved it, no you.
You're talking about scalability and using real-world resources. And I admit I don't know as much as I should about all the different coins. But as I understand it, if the whole world were to go to, say, Bitcoin, it would require more electricity than is currently generated. And I'm wondering, is that true for all coins, or maybe it's not true at all? Or are there material differences between the different coins on how energy intensive they are to maintain?
So I think there's a slight, that's a common conception, but I think it's a misconception. You don't take the amount of energy used on Bitcoin divided by the amount of transactions and multiply it out by the amount of transactions, right? The amount of energy being used on Bitcoin is entirely driven by the amount of block rewards. People are efficient actors, they're going to put an amount of resources in proportion to the rewards that they get. If the blockchain went up in size by 4 megabytes, the cost of Bitcoin mining would not go up by 4, it would go up by 0.001, it would go up by anything. So that kind of analysis, I think, is based on a misconception. That said, I certainly do think there are a lot of questions about the real world resources that this technology uses, but I'll let some other panelists go. I just wanted to say that piece.
Energy consumption is not necessarily a bad thing, like wind, solar energy, those are getting way more efficient over time. There's plenty of miners that mine on wind and solar energy. And these are very early days to say again, should we have not invented cars because they were gas guzzlers in the very beginning? Things became more efficient over time. So I think we should kind of, acknowledge that there are issues right now with maybe unnecessary energy consumption, but again, kind of look forward into the future and just keep innovating.
Well, and the absolute answer to that is there are cryptocurrencies that do not use energy as their consensus mechanism. For instance, Ripple uses a voting system.
Servers. Ripple uses its own servers, basically.
Okay, well, I'm sure that you don't quite understand the Ripple consensus because there are over 100 participants in the consensus process, and yes, Ripple are some of them. Some of them are other institutions, but also there are forms like proof of stake where instead of how much energy you contribute, it's how many coins you hold that comes in consensus. Or in the private blockchain world, just there's 3 banks or 10 banks, and they all vote on whether something's valid.
What about the coal miners?
Yeah.
say, BlockCypher recently partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and they're doing a pilot program of being able to buy and sell electricity from smart meters using Dash. And so, can you imagine you're mining Dash and someone has excess energy, you can pay some of that Dash to use electricity that's already being generated? That can be pretty cool stuff.
So in the cryptocurrency world, it seems like trust and privacy are sort of inversely proportional. And I don't claim to be a Zcash expert, but I've done research into it. And this question is mostly for Paige, but anyone that has an informed answer. How do you get to a system that's super private while still being trusted? And so specifically, you know, in Bitcoin, Dash, the other kind of proof of work coins that are public, at the very least, I can verify how many tokens are in the system. And you know, that's like somewhat of a sanity check. So how do does Zcash have strategies of doing that, cryptographically or otherwise, and how do you know whether or not it's been compromised, not just from like a de-anonymization perspective, but just like fundamentally, like there's this many tokens and is this working like it's supposed to?
Yeah,
We're
that's
almost out of time, by the way.
okay. That's definitely one of the things that we need to look into. Similarly to Monero, it's hard to essentially verify that there haven't been any counterfeited coins. To say that though, there are ways that you could essentially force people to move their money to a different kind of address that would kind of account for this money overall in total, or at least to say that there aren't more than this amount of tokens. Maybe you won't account for all of them because people lost some of their money or whatever, but there are ways that you can develop how to account for total tokens, but agree that that's potentially an issue.
Okay, well, thank you everyone, and to wrap this up, 1 or 2 word answers. How does it feel to use money that wasn't made by the government? Anyone?
Transgressive.
I don't know. Feels good as any sort of like bartering situation, I guess.
All right.
Feels good, man.
Human destiny.
All right, well, round of applause for our panelists.